Hi, everybody. Welcome to It's a Civil War, It's Personal. Hi, everybody on Facebook. We're glad you're joining us. My name is Ann Gillespie Mitchell. I have worked at Ancestry for almost 12 years, and it is by far the best job I have ever had. I'm a product manager, but I'm also a family historian. And as you all know, when you're a family historian, we tend to become maybe not experts, but we become pretty into the things that we find out about our ancestors. And one of the things I found as I started researching my ancestors is I had a lot of direct ancestors who were in the Civil War. In fact, so far I've documented 10, and I believe there were 2 more. So I've started to learn a lot about the Civil War. And one of the things I've learned is it's frustrating to research. How many of you have ancestors who are in the Civil War? How many of you find trying to put that story together is sort of a pain? We are working on a new project, and I'm going to talk about this here, that is going to, I think, make your lives easier and help you understand those stories. We're going to start releasing it in March, and this is a sneak preview into some of the things that we are doing. So how did this come about? I was researching one of my ancestors. His name is Lansford Hopper, and he was in the 28th North Carolina Infantry. And I was trying to figure out if the other Hopper in there was his brother. So I just started going through this whole company and documenting it. Do you know how long it took to do this for everybody in the company? Probably a good couple weeks. And I said to myself, this is ridiculous. We don't want to spend a couple weeks doing this, right? There has got to be a way to automate this. So I have a really, really good engineering team. And I went and I talked to them and I explained my problem. And they said, you know what? We could probably help you with that. We could probably build a really cool way to automate all this stuff. And I went to my boss and he said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Then I went to the gentleman over at American Battlefield Trust. Have y'all heard of this site? It is an awesome site. They are there to preserve and educate people about the different conflicts in America. They buy land that the battles were on, Civil War, 1812, and Revolutionary War. They get it together and then they sell it back, or they give it back to the US government. It is a wonderful site. And they also have a lot of experts. So when I have questions, when I need content, when I need videos and articles, they are here to share that with us to make your all's lives easier in understanding what's going on. I want you to think about this. We're family historians, right? We tend to do things in 10 years, right? We keep going back through the census. And there's that big 10-year gap all the time. And we wonder what happens, and we often don't know. We look at this particular family here, and it's interesting. They're in the same place in 1860 and 1870. We notice the father died and 2 of the daughters die. And you're like, well, that can't be a Civil War story, right? Because the father was too old to have served, and he was also blind. But the thing is, it was a Civil War story. This woman has written a remembrance that is riveting. It could be a movie. Somebody should really option this and make it into a movie. They lived in Arkansas. They came from Georgia, but they had Union sympathies. And the bushwhackers came into the house one night, and I won't give you all the gory details because they are pretty gory. And they were dressed in Union clothes, and they asked the man if he had Union sympathies, and he said he did. So they took him out. They killed him. They ended up shooting the 14-year-old daughter. The family then was sort of on the run. They had to go up to Kansas during the war, and then when the war was over, they came back. And if you just look at the census, you don't know that story, right? So how do we put these things together? And we also need to remember that the stories are not just about the men who served. They're about everybody who lived through the 1860s and 1870s. And I want to find ways to make it easier for you all to understand those stories. Let's look at some numbers for context. We know the US population in 1860 was about 31 million people. 21 million people, more or less, in the northern states. 2 million men fought for the Union Army. In the South, there were 10 million people, but remember, about 4 million of those people were enslaved. And they have a totally different set of stories, right? And those stories are fascinating. 750,000 men fought for the Confederacy, but it is worth noting that 180,000 African Americans fought for the Union, and many of those were escaped slaves. Those are great stories. And I also believe if we can start to put together those stories of those African Americans and start to do more in their pension records, we can make that connection to where they were slaves and where they came from and maybe start to put those families together. And that is a piece of this project that I'm truly excited about. We also know more than 620,000 men died in the Civil War. Think of the families that were disrupted. Nothing was the same because of this. And then in 1870, we had 38 million people. That's all the things that happened. Between 2 and 3% of the population died in the Civil War. If you want to translate that in today's terms, that would be between 6 and 10 million people. Think for a minute if 6 to 10 million people died over the next 10 years in this country. That would be news. That would be devastating, and it would change how we look at things. There were about 30 million people in 1860. There are 30 million stories that we need to tell. And we need to build a better infrastructure on Ancestry and Fold 3 and Find a Grave and newspapers that will let it enable you to find your ancestors' story so you understand that personal bit of history. Because your ancestors were part of history. And if you know where they fought, if you know the communities and how they were impacted, I think it will change the way you look at your family. So how do you do this? Well, we all know the story of Lincoln, right? He gets his own movie. Your ancestors don't, unless you're related to Lincoln, but he gets his own movie. There's Grant, there's Lee, lots and lots of books, Stonewall Jackson, Sherman. I mean, these are interesting stories, and these are people that are larger than life, and your ancestors may have fought for them or run from them. But we want to look at different people. We want to look at the average, everyday American. And there were also a lot of immigrants that came over that served because that was an easy way for citizenship. But who was Charles Mitchell? No relation to me. Just a random guy in the 107th Volunteers who got shot. But you know that changed his life. He got shot in the ankle, and I'm sure he was disabled. What about William Thomas Alexander? I love these pictures. You find a lot of them on the Library of Congress. He looks a little wild-eyed. But what was his story? Who was he? Who was his family? Who did he fight with? What battles was he in? And then there's Solomon Ward. He was an escaped slave. He was born in Maryland, moved up to New York with his family, and he served, and they called them the colored troops. We refer to things in terms we don't refer to them today. But he fought. He survived the war. He got a pension. I mean, what is his story? Does his family know? Because I think these are important stories. This is the Electoral Map from 1860. I'll bet you $1 most of you don't know who Breckinridge and Bell were, but did your ancestors vote for them? It's interesting to look at this map. And this brings up the point. How many of you have heard someone say, the country has never been more divided than it was today? I'm going to say, pretty certain we've been more divided. So who has a story to tell during the Civil War? Everyone living in the US, right? You didn't have to fight. People in your community went and fought. Or you could be like that family who was chased up to Kansas by the bushwhackers. So it's everyone living in the Union states. So if you lived in the North, your life was different, right? You probably believed different things. You read different newspapers. You had a different set of understanding about what was going on. If you lived in the Confederate States, you had a different understanding of how life should be. Your story is going to be molded by that. Then there's the border states. If you lived in Kansas or Maryland or Kentucky, those states, neighbors were fighting neighbors, and there was a lot of violence and guerrilla warfare that went on. Your ancestors' version of the war is quite different. Then there's people who live in the U.S. territories. How many of you had people who were in the Utah Territory during the 1860s? They tended not to participate in the war. They had it. They moved out here, and they just didn't want much to do with the federal government. We have the story of the men in the Union Army and the Confederate Army. We have the story of the slaves. Did they run away and fight for the Union? When they were emancipated, did they follow Sherman through Georgia? What was their story, and how do we tell it? And then people who lived near the battles. If you think about it, if you were living near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, when that battle went down, the armies left, and they left a lot of their dead on the field. And that happened in many battles. And the townspeople had to deal with that. We changed our whole idea of death and what it meant and how we dealt with the corpses. That affected what your ancestors did, even if they didn't fight. There were 384 battles in the Civil War, and these are what we call significant battles. There were also about 8,000 hostilities. You think about that. How many of you seen the Ken Burns documentary? He talks about how it was fought in 10,000 places, and it really was. There were all these little skirmishes that happened everywhere, and they may not mean anything to you, but if they happened where your ancestor lived, that was their story of the Civil War. So we need to look at the people who fought in them. We need to look at the families of the men fighting in them, right? Because if you're sitting at home with 3 young children while your husband is off at war, that is a tense time. And you don't know if your husband's coming back. And if he doesn't, what does that mean for your life? Families were destroyed. One of the interesting things about the Civil War is the companies tended to be raised in communities. All right, so somebody would go out and he would get all his neighbors and they would start a company and they would belong to a regiment and then they would go off and fight. So everybody sort of knew each other. In fact, a lot of them were related. And this is sort of how we can determine who was there, and we might be able to find information because we know a lot of them were related. Also think about it. If that particular company was at the wrong place at the wrong time and was totally taken out in some battle, think of the effect that had on the community. A whole generation of men was just gone. What did that mean in that community? Because they didn't come home. People who lived near battles. Also, even if your ancestors didn't fight, it changed their lives. The whole country changed, and they read about it, they knew what was going on, and it was important to them. This was also the first war that was photographed. How many of you have heard of Matthew Brady? Well, the technology was not set up so you could actually take pictures while the battle was going on. They had these little carts that they would follow around these battles, and they would take pictures of the dead on the battlefield. And then they would display these, and people would come in and look at them. Can you imagine? That really changed how people thought about war. It wasn't always this glorious, glamorous thing that you saw in drawings. It became very real when you see a picture of a corpse on a battlefield. So, where did we decide to start? Well, one of the things we did is we contacted our friends at American Battlefield Trust. The gentleman you see here is Gary Edelman. He works for them. He is an expert. I know a few things about the battles, but Gary knows almost everything. And if he doesn't, he knows who we can contact. American Battlefield is going to share with us articles and pictures and videos so that we can pull these in, and when we find your ancestor and we can tell you what war they're in, we can tell you what that war was like, or excuse me, what that battle was like, so we can really educate you. They have an amazing amount of content, and working with them is really going to bring this project to life. So how do we organize to tell a meaningful story? Again, we have to put them in communities. So what we decided to do is we've been working to pull all this data, and I'm going to talk about this more in another class at 3, but we're taking all this data and we're putting it in regiments. Now, one of the things that we found is we tend to organize our data at Ancestry so it fits into trees. This is not a surprise to anybody, right? Names, dates, relationships. That's what's important. But if you're trying to tell the story of the Civil War and you want to mash them all together, what do you need? You need the company information and the regiment information. So we are working with so many different groups at Ancestry, full 3 newspapers, and Find a Grave right now. We're pulling out new information, we're getting it re-indexed. We are building new technology to take all the data collections that we have and data collections in other places and to merge them together. One of the things I've found is there is no one comprehensive list that is correct or doesn't have duplicates. So we're trying to figure out how we do that. It's new, it's exciting, and we're pretty thrilled with what we're coming up with. We've created a new organizing principle, and this will fit into trees, right? Everything we do is around trees, but this technology and this project will be totally different. And we will come up with something that when we organize these people into regiments and you plug your ancestor into it, I can tell you the story. We can take all these records, and we've got a lot of them if you look at all of our properties. And we're going to start stitching them together so that we can figure out who was who and then eventually have enough data to merge them into your tree. There's a lot of data. So what we're working on right now, and these are not live on the site, but I have a very talented group of UX and product people. They're over at the Fold 3 booth, who are helping us put these together. We'll start on Fold 3. You'll be able to go to Fold 3. You'll start on our regiment page, our Civil War story page, and you can type in the name of a regiment, and you can or type in a battle, and we'll be able to show you information. Now, to start with, it'll mostly focus on battles. It's the easiest piece for us to get in. But we're also working on pulling in all the soldiers and assigning them to regiments, so you'll be able to find your soldier in a regiment. You'll be able to search for any battle or regiment, and we'll also give you timelines for the regiment. When did the regiment first start? Who were its officers? Who were its leaders? And then we'll eventually break it down into companies. We'll give you all the battles they fought in. Then you can go back into the service records and figure out where your ancestor was and what battles he was in. I really think this will make it come to life for you. And you'll also know what people were looking at back home. Because if your ancestor was in the Eastern Front fighting at Gettysburg, that's a whole different sensibility than if you were a family who was in Vicksburg and lived there during the siege. That's a whole different story. Or if you were in New Orleans, was occupied by Union soldiers for most of the war. Or maybe you had an ancestor that was up in the Dakotas fighting with the Native Americans. It depends on where your ancestor was. That's how you're going to see the Civil War. And we are putting all this together. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put battle pages and the regiments in there. So you'll be able to search for all that. Then we're going to put all the soldiers with the regiments as we pull all this data together. Now we're going to start state by state because there's a group of records that apply to everybody, but then each state has their own records. You want to talk about crazy, unorganized? That was our country in 1861. We're going to start with North Carolina. I picked it because I know it pretty well because I had ancestors from North Carolina, and you start with what you know and then you branch out. Then we're going to move up to the New York, which has a lot of data and a lot of people because we think that will be interesting. Then we're going to start in on the African American soldiers because that is a wealth of information, and I think we're going to come up with really, really good stories. And then we'll just start picking off states one by one, and soon we'll have them all. Then, this project doesn't work without all of you. I need you guys to be able to contribute. You have the letters, you have the stories. You'll be able to look at the data and let us know, no, these two people are not different people, they're really the same person. Or you've got records that you say are one person, but they're really two people. You all will be the experts on your ancestors. Nobody knows their ancestors as well as you do. So if we can get you all to participate, I think we are going to have something pretty brilliant. If you go to this page on Fold 3, Fold 3/Project Regiment, we'll put updates about what's coming and what you can expect. Also, for those of you, and I know you're out there, who are experts on a specific regiment or a specific company because you know who your ancestor was, if you go to this link, It's just a survey. Bit.ly Civil War Stories. You can give me your email address. I won't use it for anything else. I'll send you an invite to a group and the states that you know. And as we roll them out, we'll invite you to come and help us put it together. And you can share your knowledge with us so we can make the project better. That's it. What do y'all think? It's going to be fun? All right. Thank you guys. I really appreciate it.